Hello, welcome back to China Manufacturing Decoded from the Sofeast Group. Adrian hosting today, but Renaud is with me also. Hello, Renaud again.
Hello, Adrian, and everybody.
Well, Renaud, today it's episode 202. We're into February 24 now, and I think you got an email recently from a customer, right? And so we're going to kind of cover the topic that you were discussing with this customer and shed some
Mm.
light on it for the listeners. And they were asking you what your suggestion was for a quality assurance auditing and inspection program for products they were launching. And to be specific, we're talking about electro-mechanical products here, not sort of
Mm.
textiles and other things like that. Okay, so the listeners, I think, let's go through this sort of program for them, and then maybe they can get a good idea of what's sort of included and the benefits and what is involved. Okay.
Mm. Right, right. In that case, it was for a B2B type of electronic product with some mechanical components and things like that. But what we're about to discuss really applies to many types of, electromechanical products. It's very, very wide, right? Very wide.
Okay.
Mm. Well, first, I mean, why were they asking for such a program? Well, because they needed assurance, right? That the supplier would actually do a good job and deliver good products to them. And then told them, well, if that's really super important to you and you have a budget for that, you have to involve us from sort of the end of the product design phase and then all along as the new product is industrialized and goes into production. Because
Mm.
if, of course, if it's a, I don't know, relatively simple product like a Bluetooth speaker or something like that, and then the same factory has been making it, for years, and it's a very mature kind of product, you don't need to worry about these kind of things. As long as the factory confirmed there's a good alignment and you see what they're doing, and yeah, there's a good alignment. They're used to making this kind of product with these kinds of components and this kind of assembly and other processes, and they're used to these kinds of quality standard, and they know how to test and inspect and so on. The risks are minimal, again, especially for relatively simple products.
Mm.
And again, if production is mature, they've been doing that over and over and over. And we explained what that means a few episodes ago with Paul when we explained what's the experience effect, right? The experience effect is very, very strong in manufacturing. Um, so they have the experience. Okay, they know how to do it. It's not a new product for them. No need. In that case, you just have a look at the production they're doing the first time, and you see, it's if it's really, really good and they have good systems in place and everything. Okay, you can trust them to a large extent. However, if you have a really new product, innovative new product, and that's what we tend to work on at Sofeast. We work for companies that actually develop a new product, like new to the world, right? And then there's a lot
Yeah.
of challenges and a lot of unknowns and a lot of things to get right. And it's really important to be structured and so on. And that's where we're strong. That's what we work on. Okay. So in this case, as I mentioned, bring us in earlier, because otherwise, well, if your product designers are pretty good, and if the manufacturer is pretty good at industrializing and pretty good at manufacturing, which by the way, don't necessarily go hand in hand, then the risks are low, all right. However, we're talking production, in places like China, India, Vietnam. Um, some of the very big manufacturers are good at industrializing a product and following the new product introduction process, and really good at manufacturing in very controlled conditions and so on. But they are a tiny minority, really a tiny minority. Most of the
Mm.
manufacturers in China, but also in India, in Vietnam, again, in some of these other, let's say, low cost Asia kind of countries, don't really know how to do that very well, right? And the biggest ones that tend to work for the biggest companies, the biggest brand names, or very often these biggest brand names, the HP, Microsoft, Apple, or whatever, GE, Electrolux, and so on, they have their own processes and they take the new product introduction process in their own hands, right? And so that means if you go to a manufacturer without all the structure that their customers usually have, well, good luck getting a good result. The manufacturer doesn't, on their own, doesn't really know what to do. They're not structured, they're not organized for that. And also, if you are not going to move millions or tens of millions of products, you're not going to get the experienced project managers and experienced quality managers and so on, right? You're going to get the B
Mm.
team, C team kind of people, and they're not going to come and put together a plan that makes sense and so on and so forth. Or if they do, you're really lucky. Okay, so that's why a proper quality assurance program starts, let's say, when the final prototype, pre-production, pre-tooling, right, is being put together. And then
Yeah.
we can go through the main topics that we cover usually, like one by one, right? So the first thing that we usually advise is to do a DFM review, okay, on the custom design components. So, for example, if there's a custom designed enclosure that will be injection molded, in plastic at high pressure, well, there's some good general good practices, all right? And if you don't follow these good practices, you're going to have quality issues, production issues, quality issues, also obviously the supplier will tend to tell you, about the draft angles and things like that so that the parts get ejected easily because it makes it easy for them to make production in a smooth way. But there's some
Yeah.
other topics that will produce quality defects, visual defects where the part might be a bit scratched on the side or it might be a bit burned or something like that, right? So it's important to think about that and look at the design files and already think of the ease of making the product properly. Also, like, I don't know,
Mm.
if it's kind of thick, maybe it's going to be more likely to shrink. If it's long, yeah, maybe it's going to warp a bit. There's a lot of things that happen. Same thing on metal parts. Like, for example, if you want a cast part, a die cast, well, there's a number of things that you want to think of, maybe add some ribs and so on. So some of them are the same idea as plastic injection molding. Some of them are pretty different. For example, if you want to be nicely painted, okay, that's one thing. If you want it to be anodized, well, what about the porosity of the part? Is that going to be an issue? So there's all kinds of considerations to take into
Mm.
account and what tolerances, etc., etc. Okay, so a review, so basically, if you're pretty confident, your mechanical engineers know these things are very, very, very comfortable with the manufacturing processes and so on. Okay, fine. But if you rely on the supplier for that and they haven't given you any structured feedback on, based on the design for manufacturing review, that's an issue. Also, it's not just about design for manufacturing of the parts, also it's design for assembly, right?
Mm.
um, like, why do you need so many screws and why, um, how are people going to align these two things? Like, they can't even see it. They're going to fumble. And from time to time, it's not going to be done properly. There's going to lead to quality issues, etc. So a proper review of the design will often prevent some serious issues just by pointing at the risks and then
Mm.
suggesting some improvements, right? there's so many issues that come from the design, right? If you put the finger on the issue, on the risk, before tooling is made, then it's it's much cheaper and much faster, right? Make a few
Oh yeah.
fixes, and then you go into tooling with how to say with peace of mind, right? Or even if there's no
Mm.
tooling, right? Picking the right, I don't know, the right kind of coating and things like that. So that's one thing. The FM reviews. Okay. Another one is the suppliers that were picked. Okay, so there's some critical components, right? So typical electronic product, maybe the battery, the PCBA, maybe there's a display, um, right? A few things like that.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a camera, right? If it's non-electronic, but maybe there's, I don't know, there's an actuator, uh, something, some moving parts, etc. Some of them maybe need to have very tight tolerances, so dimensional control is very important. Okay, you need to think of the risks. Okay, this is really the main theme here. What are the main risks and how to keep them under control,
Hmm.
right? And how to prevent them if possible, right? So if the suppliers of the critical components have a very good quality system and the components are very mature and everything, okay, that's great, right? But and then you don't need to follow very closely on them. However, if you send an auditor there and the auditor says, well, this is a relatively small place, they don't have a quality system, um, they just put things together, there's one or two inspectors and they don't work in a systematic manner. They don't work to certain like specifications and things are not really documented and um and by the way, this and this kind of tests that are so important, they don't even have the equipment in house to do these tests and so on. Well, guess what? You're gonna have to follow it more closely, right? And
Mm.
maybe that just means working with your main supplier. Let's say the main supplier is going to do assembly, let's say a little bit of processing, maybe in an assembly. So they're going to receive all these parts. They're going to have to do incoming quality control on these parts. But you're going to have to work with them to define a clear standard and maybe have like checking fixtures and gauges and things like that and work with them so that they check a higher proportion of the ports when they arrive, right? Because the risk is higher, right?
Mm.
But you need to know that the risk is higher. And maybe if it's if the risk is high, well, maybe you need to actually have an inspector at that factory making whatever, the display or the camera or the battery or something to do certain tests and do a visual check and so on, just to catch a bad batch before it goes into your main supplier's factory. And just by mistake, it might go through incoming quality control, right? So,
Mm.
or work with your main supplier so that they have someone over there to do an outgoing QC check before the parts even leave the component supplier, right? So again, you need to know your risks, right? And when I say, okay, this is about the qualification of the suppliers of the critical parts, but it's also good to review the at least the documentation about the parts. Okay, and that's especially true for two topics: compliance and reliability. So, for example, you're going to buy a charger, a power supply um, that plugs into a wall. That's typically a compliance critical uh, component, right?
Yeah.
And most of the time, you're going to buy something standard off the shelf and you want it to be pre-certified, right? But pre-certified to what? There's a lot of confusion about that. If it's going to be for some kind of lifting device, well, the standards for compliance are going to be different from another application such as charging an electric bike, right? And people just think, oh, okay, it's like it's UL listed or whatever, UL certified, blah blah blah, or oh, it's got CE marking for that. Okay, well, you need to actually go into the details and really understand that, and a lot of people get that
Mm.
wrong. So an understanding of all these different standards and how to research that is actually quite important. Otherwise, you think you get everything all right, but your product actually is not compliant at all, right? And you get a
Mm.
absolutely critical part that is not certified to the right standard. So it's really not compliant for your application. Okay, so that
Mm.
I mentioned compliance. Another one about reliability is um, okay. Again, that's really only for products that do need to be reliable, right? If it's a one-off, free sort of giveaway promotional product or something, just needs to look good,
Yep.
just needs to have the logo in the right colors. Who cares? But if it's a medium to high reliability product, well, you need the key components also to be reliable because when one of them breaks, the entire product breaks. So they should be more reliable than what you expect from the entire product.
Mm.
And a few questions, asking the supplier to provide their reliability test results, you know, with a clear explanation of what is the plan, what were the points on which it was tested and the parameters and everything. And that's where very, very fast you see if they even understand what you're talking about. And unfortunately, in many cases, they don't, right? They say, oh, yeah, okay, we tested it, but okay, but how? What did you do? Well, oh, and then like a lot of them would just stop communicating. Well, you got a problem right here, right?
Mm.
You're not going to have a reliable product if you pick suppliers that can't tell you anything about their own components reliability. So that's about the components because
Mm.
bad components will lead to bad products, right? And there's a lot of cases where you can really catch that before production, before
Mm.
you fully confirm, all right, these are the suppliers we're going to use. Okay.
And that
So that,
that that'll be
mm.
through auditing these suppliers, like you said, so boots on the
And
ground, as it were.
yeah, and also asking for some information about the
Mm.
components. Right, right.
Going back to the compliance, I mean, what we do know is that market surveillance authorities are becoming kind of more militant in making sure that the products coming into certain areas, such as the EU or the
Mm,
US, are going to be safe and compliant. And I think the two often, like regulatory compliance, often goes kind of hand in hand with safety a lot of the time, doesn't it? So it's, because is it compliant? Well, why? Why do we make it compliant? So it's not posing a risk to people and property. I mean, even today, and we're recording at the start of February, you've shared a post about Amazon. Amazon are going to potentially be held to account for the products being sold on their
mm,
platform in the US.
mm,
And that
mm,
means, of course, that
mm.
Amazon are going to start leaning on their vendors because Amazon aren't going to take responsibility without making sure that you are also, responsible for the compliance of the products and the safety of the products.
In the case of Amazon, the CPSC in the US has not ruled yet, right? And then Amazon already appealed from a decision, and then
Sure, they
we
did.
don't really know. It just looks
Right.
probable that Amazon will be held accountable for the
Yeah.
safety of the products they sell in the US. But they are already accountable in the EU anyway.
Mm,
That's in
mm,
place since 2019.
hmm
They are an economic operator. They are whatever
mm.
they call it, fulfillment provider or something like that. I forgot the exact
Yes.
name in the EU Commission's terminology, but they
Yeah.
are accountable. So let's say in the EU, there's a lot of
hmm
requirements safety wise, and there's more and more requirements also sustainability wise, right? And
Yeah.
we talked about that in some
Mm.
episodes and a lot on the website. So,
Absolutely. So if your
mm,
supplier is not up on this stuff, that's a potential red flag because you could be going into, dangerous waters.
Yes. So you really need to have an idea about where you're going to sell your product, how to say, what the application is going to be, what of the product, and then what requirements apply to your product based on that. And then you really need to have a pretty good idea about the main risks, okay, and at least
Mm.
cover the main risks. And we see a lot of people really, really completely skip that or do it in a very wrong way.
Mm.
And in some cases, they get caught, and yeah, in some cases, if it's not a big company, a bad batch that is caught and can't be sold and is rejected and so on, or if they're forced to pay for a recall, I mean, that can be the end of the company, right? So,
Oh yeah.
not something to play with, I would say. Mhm.
No. Especially not after you've gone to all the trouble to actually, bring a new product to market. It just seems crazy to not also think about this. Right, okay, great.
Mm.
So there's a third point, and so we'll move on to that.
Right. So then, again, as I mentioned, you typically have a main supplier. They're going to do assembly. They might also do PCBA, or they might also do plastic injection molding, or some other things like that, upstream processes. But they're also going to pull all the components together, and they have a plan for ensuring that the final product meets your specifications. Okay, so that's your main supplier. So there's a lot of things that they have to get right before they get into mass production. And very often people just say, well, okay, you're a manufacturer, right? You know how to do, right? Yeah, but if your product, I don't know, is um, a wafer maker and you work with a toaster company, it's going to be new for them, right? So
Mm.
that's why this whole discussion is about the case where you have a new innovative product. So it's new. It's got at least, a few, how to say, uh, there's at least a few topics with the product that are going to be new to the manufacturer. And maybe
Mm.
a lot more than that. Maybe everything is new, right? So are they actually ready for that? Have they actually prepared their organization for that? So let's go through a few examples, right?
Okay.
So first, they need to brief their own suppliers, right? The suppliers of components, what exactly is required. They need to document the requirement for your product, make sure it's documented and the suppliers understand it and agreed with it. Okay, because otherwise, how are the suppliers going to know? And ideally, there would be golden samples and things like that. I'm talking about custom design parts, right? If it's standard off the shelf, um, the supplier would have sent a few samples, and then a few of these samples would be kept as a reference for the quality standard. But as soon as it's custom design component that has to be done, again, a new component, new to the world, needs to be made, there has to be a clear quality standard for that.
Mm.
And maybe you just worked on a 3D design or something and sends them and they say, okay, it's fine. Well, have they translated it into a two-dimensional design? Are there tolerances? Is it clear which um, dimensional points are critical to quality, right? What about the exact material? What about the kind of finishing, the kind of coating or whatever, what kind of effect? Is it matte? Is it glossy? All these kind of things. Is it clear? Is it documented? Otherwise, they they don't take the time to do that. They rely on luck, basically, right? But then if there's some issues in the end, who's going to pay for that? You're going to pay
Mm.
for a part of it or maybe all of it, right? So you need to keep pressure on them so that they actually get that right. Okay. Another one is, and it's related, how are they doing or how are they going to do incoming quality control, right? Do they have the right inspection and testing equipment? Do they have a, a clear documented standard about the key the key topics to look for, and so on, right?
Mm.
What is the plan to get the assembly going, to have the people trained on how to actually work on your product? Are the testing stations ready? I mean, that's one thing, especially for electrical electronic products. Very often testing stations need to be custom made, and very often they're late. Um, the all the work instructions and standard operating procedures, all the way to, down to the operators on the line, right? Is it clear? You have to do number one, number two, number three, with a little photo to explain, and maybe, one or two tips, and maybe a critical point to keep in mind. Is it documented for the people who will do the work, but also for the line leader when people are working and he's walking around and he needs to double check if they're doing it the right way, right? Very important.
Mm.
How are they going to test the finished product, right? What can they test internally? Do they need to send to an external lab? What are they going to do? Ideally, they would also condense a lot of that in a control plan, which is a must in the automotive industry and is also quite important, quite useful for any kind of manufacturing, really, right? And then, okay, they put together some prototypes. Do they have some lessons learned? Like, at least, do they have they kept a list of issues, maybe on a whiteboard, maybe somewhere in Excel, right? What are the issues they faced? Have they done something to prevent that? Because if the engineers are struggling with something, chances are the operators are going to struggle with it also, right? Um, List of risks, same thing. What are the risks? Do they have a list of risks, or are they just making it up as they go, not really planning? Okay. And I talked about the quality standard for the components, but same thing. Quality standard about the final product is very important, right? Do they already have a golden sample? If tooling was involved, is it made with parts coming off of tooling? So all of that is quite important. Have people been trained to it? Do people on the line actually have easy access to a golden sample if they have a question, right? So all of this is the typical preparation. I'm talking just about assembly, but if they're doing some upstream manufacturing processes, yeah, again, like maybe SMT process to populate the PCB, well, same thing. What is special about
Mm.
it? What have they done? Have they configured everything already? So that's really that's sort of about the preparation, right? So uh, points one, two, and three, which I just covered, are about the preparation of, yeah, the whole, the product design and the process design, let's say, right?
Yeah.
Manufacturing process and testing process.
Mm. Yes, because in number four, we're actually using the manufacturing process now, but we're not quite in mass production, are we?
Right. So again, if it's a new innovative product, you don't go right away into making a batch of, 10,000 pieces.
Mm.
Like, Apple doesn't let Foxconn go ahead, right? Oh, okay, prototype is fine. Let's next step put together 10,000 pieces. It just doesn't
Mm.
happen. Or I don't know, Toyota or General Motors, or they in their own car assembly plants, they would not start. Okay, let's go straight into it, and the target is 1 minute per car, and I want one car out of the line every minute, and just go at
Mm.
it, right? Doesn't happen. They have a process to uh, to run at increasing rates, and they release the material little by little, and they do validation runs, right? So to validate the production process, the testing process, and so on. So okay, again, we need to cut it into two separate things. First is the production of the custom components. And this is informed by the risk analysis coming from the factory audits that we mentioned before. If
Mm.
some of the custom component producers are pretty weak, quality system wise, well, it's important to have a look at what they're doing. And ideally, if you have the visibility and the access to these guys, you need to consider maybe sending someone when they do, first forcing them to do a pilot run, small run first, right? Maybe 50
Mm.
pieces, 100 pieces, and no more. And maybe having someone on site to see what they're doing and to report on, okay, what are the main issues? What did they manage to do? Is it good? Is it not good? And what percentage of the products were good the first time, right?
Mm.
That's really important at several levels. And is it easy to rework and things like that? Because this is also related to the ability of these component suppliers to raise the price later, because they might say, well, there's 20% defective products, defective parts, and we did not expect
Mm.
that. It's really high.
Mm.
But if you have someone on site who say, well, no, 5% were bad, the rest was okay, and this was on a small run, so on a big run, it might be 1%, because it was mostly at the beginning when they were kind of doing the setup and everything. Then you can fight back. But if you don't know, then you're like, oh, 20%. Oh, all right, let's raise the price for this part and for this one
Mm.
and for this one. Right? In the end, it can be
Yes.
a big impact on your product price. So
Oh, yeah.
that's one thing. And the second part is about assembly, the assembly process. Okay, well, same thing. They're doing a pilot run. Great. Is somebody on site to actually check it up? And
Mm.
or maybe we'll wait until it's finished and do a first article inspection, the first five pieces, check them like, very deeply, and like a function test, and open them up and look at the way things are soldered and things like that, right? To make sure, okay, you guys are on the right track
Mm.
versus, oh, there's these issues, have you guys caught that? No, well, you know, don't go too far because there's some issues here. Okay. And then the feedback loop, you want to make the feedback loop as tight as possible so that they go back into the their process and make adjustments as necessary. Okay, so
Mm.
that's the basically the monitoring and follow up and providing feedback during the production pilot runs. That was number four.
Yeah.
And well, number five is simply doing product inspections during production and after production, basically before shipment. On maybe the first batch after the pilot run might be, I don't know, 1,000 pieces, and after that maybe 3,000 pieces, and after that maybe 5,000 pieces, or maybe they go into a continuous production mode, and every week they will send two containers or something like that. So, like one container a week and then two containers a week, for example. Then you have
Mm.
some uh, regular production checks, because chances are it's still going to be very cheap related to the cost of having bad products delivered in wherever, right? In
Oh,
the
yeah.
UK, in the US, in Germany, and so on. It's going to be much, much cheaper. And you want to give to give feedback right away to production so
Mm.
that they can work on the issues. And you want to make these issues visible. Now, that's really, really, really important. And something also that I should mention, I know we talked a bunch of times on this podcast about product reliability, but again, this comes into play. You on electromechanical products that are supposed to last and be functional for at least 1, 2, 3 years. Bad reliability will mean bad quality. People are not going to be happy, right?
Mm.
So yeah. For example, when they're in production and there's different batches, um, maybe and again, this depends really from one type of product to another type of product, and also the safety implications of having bad products. But in some cases, we keep an eye on traceability, the traceability system of the factory. Can we trace a batch of components to some finished products? Can we trace some finished products back to the batches of components? And and which ones were reworked, which one went on that machine versus that machine? How fine grained is it? And does it all make sense with the inspection and testing processes, checking up the recalls and cross-checking and things like that? Because in some cases, traceability is really very important. Maybe that's a topic for another podcast.
Mm.
And also, yeah, when there's different batches, how to make sure that it's consistent, because from one batch to another, well, maybe that batch number 3 of batteries, maybe there's an issue with the BMS, or maybe that batch number 5 of this, I don't know, uh, steel that is electroplated. Well, maybe there's an issue with it, and the plating might wear off way too fast, for example, just on that batch, right? And
Yeah.
you're gonna have some variation, and you want to keep that variation to a minimum. So you need to keep monitoring, and
Mm.
there's a little bit of a shortcut to that, which is to pick some samples and send them to a lab like ours for some ongoing reliability testing, right?
Mm.
And just on typically 2 or 3 samples, and do some of the tests on them in a rough way, right? You just want to find if there's a significant difference or not. Because
Yeah.
again, if I don't know, batch number 3, maybe there's a problem with the BMS of the battery, well, that might have enormous implications. Maybe you have 5,000 pieces out there. There's something wrong. The product is supposed to, I don't know, turn off when the temperature reaches whatever, 80 degrees Celsius, but it doesn't suddenly because there's a
Mm.
problem with the BMS. Well, you might have to do a product recall that might cost an enormous amount of money, and really, really mess up your relationship with your main customers. So
Oh yeah.
uh, keeping an eye on what happens from batch to batch is really part of a quality assurance process. Like a comprehensive program, let's say, that
Mm.
really tries to catch the issues and mitigate the risks. That's really the whole topic of today's episode, right?
Yeah, great. It definitely doesn't end with, the products start coming off the line. And I
Mm.
know that we've spoken about it before. And it's good that you mentioned ongoing reliability testing as well. I mean, you mentioned one of the worst cases, which is a product recall. And yeah, I mean, there's the potential for injury, fires, things like that. But at the very least, you don't want a load of warranty claims and a load of bad reviews as a business.
Yep,
Like if
of
you can
course,
if
right.
you can avoid that by doing ORT, which should be relatively inexpensive in comparison, then
Mm.
yeah, I mean that's
Mm.
that's brilliant
Yeah, you
advice.
will not avoid it. Let's be careful the way we say it. You will
Okay,
not
okay.
avoid it. Yeah, you will stop. You will detect it. That's the
Yeah, yeah,
correct
yeah,
word.
yeah.
You will detect it while the products are still at the factory. So you
Mm,
can say, "What? Wait a minute. Let's go into more in-depth testing to really understand. And maybe you need to get a new batch, and and I don't want that batch of batteries. Send it all
mm,
back to the battery factory, whatever." You keep the problems at the factory. You don't let them ship to you. So you detect. The fact that you
yeah.
detect, you're not happy, but you would be in much deeper trouble if you did not detect it, and if you let them
Mm,
ship out and you send the payment, and da, 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 and then some water runs under the bridge, right? And then you go back to them 2 or 3 months later when you start to have some people complain about it, and they're gonna be like, "What are you talking about?" Like it's so last year.
yeah.
And it's much harder to get them to actually do something at that point.
Especially if, Chinese New Year has come and gone as well, for example, which we've got coming up
Oh,
soon.
This is the big reset button, right?
Yeah.
The memory reset. Broop, okay,
Mm.
forget everything. Sorry. And
Yeah.
Chinese New Year, again, it depends on the quality system of the factory. If things are nicely documented and they really made it, how to say, your requirements nicely made it into the working documents and working, basically the day-to-day processes of the people at the factory, they should not need to rely a lot on their memory. But if you
Mm.
work, I'm sorry to say that, but with a crappy supplier that relies on people's memories and doesn't work on their processes, and they don't work in a smart way,
Mm.
well, then you're gonna have this problem of the the memory reset button syndrome, right? Especially with Chinese New Year, but even without Chinese New Year, 2 or 3 months, poof, they worked on some other
Mm.
jobs for some other customers, poof, they're gonna forget. That's just
Mm.
the way of life.
Yeah. So it won't surprise the listener to hear that because this is literally from you speaking to a customer of Sofeast, that we do provide all of the activities that you've discussed in terms of solutions that we can find on our website. And so check the show notes. I'll leave links to everything relevant to what you've discussed today. And if you're thinking, oh yeah, I could do with help with any of these, then just follow those links and we can totally discuss your project with you and come up with a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, Adrian, and thanks, everybody.
Thanks again for listening to this podcast brought to you by the Sofeast Group. We're on a mission to provide you with everything you need to manufacture effectively in Asia, including inspections, auditing, new product development support, contract manufacturing, 3PL warehousing and fulfillment, and much, much more across Asia's key manufacturing areas. Visit us at sofeast.com, that's SOFEAST.com, to learn more and get help. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, please do rate, review and share because it will really help others discover us too.